lies very firmly on the Stoic basis of indifference. That is, the only thing that can make you happy is virtue, which has to be achieved by following perfect reason, and that all other things in the world are indifference. They're neither good or bad in and of themselves. There's nothing that makes them a problem or something desirable, but they're not to be chased after in one way or another. Any kind of position from which one might exercise leadership, whether that's from a political platform, as a head of an organisation, of a division, a department, or in a community organising context, is thus not something for the aspiring Stoic to chase after for purely its own sake. It's important not to get confused here, though. The fact that indifferents are, indifferent, means that if these kinds of positions come along, they're not necessarily to be avoided. Right? They're not necessarily something you say, no, get thee behind me. If the possibility comes along for a Stoic to hold one of these positions, and if all other things are equal, then there's absolutely no reason for her not to agree to take up the position of leadership that she's been offered. There are pros and cons for both. The leadership opportunity might mean there's a real chance to make a difference to the circumstances of others, which would then allow them to be virtuous themselves and thus gain happiness and sort of really improving the lot of lots of people. There might be a real opportunity there. Alternatively, taking on such a responsibility might mean that you lose track of what you're supposed to be paying attention to, and you lose focus on the pursuit of virtue, you become misguided about what's actually important in life, and instead of sort of paying attention to that, you get distracted by the quest after something that's not actually very meaningful at all. And one of the charges that's often laid against Seneca when he's accused of hypocrisy, loads of people accuse Seneca of hypocrisy, and it's really irritating. One of the things that he's accused of is that he was perfectly happy to operate as sort of the ancient equivalent of a high-level civil servant, with all the perks and influences that involves, and sort of the argument made is that is sort of a hypocritical thing for somebody who is advocating Stoicism to say. But it's worth remembering in this context that he started down this path because he was sought out in person to be the childhood tutor of the Emperor Nero, when the Emperor Nero was still a boy, by Nero's mother. He didn't go seeking the opportunity for office. It found him. And once he'd been in the position of tutor, that gradually evolved into the advisor position which most people associate with him. I should note, as a matter of scrupulous fairness, that the reason he was invited to come back and take this position up was because he was in exile at the time. And Agrippina, the mother of the Emperor Nero, went, I know how I will get somebody on side. I will bring him back from exile. So, there's perhaps not entirely a lack of self-interest in the arrangement to come forward, but it's a very different kind of coming into power than we might sort of think of. It's very different to the kind of political hackery that Seneca is sometimes accused of, for instance. And I rather suspect that he would think rather poorly of the current British political system, where parliamentary candidates seek nominations and then sort of official positions in cabinet, shadow cabinet, often driven by their own personal ambition, rather than any consideration for the wider community, or indeed the effects that the decisions they make in those positions might have on their virtue. Now that said, it is possible to find oneself in a position of leadership in the modern world without having compromised one's virtue to get there. You might have been invited to apply for a job. There might have been an appropriate selection process in your workplace or organisation. There are all sorts of ways that you might be given a chance for leadership without basically having to run after it. So what is the aspiring Stoic supposed to do when she gets into that position of authority? Well, clearly, not run riot with the budget and buy duck houses. That was a very British joke. For the rest of my talk, I want to turn to Seneca's De Clementia, or On Clemency, and think a little bit about what his discussion of this ancient virtue might be able to tell us in the modern world. Now, I'm going to refer to the virtue as clementia as I speak, mainly because it's close enough to the modern clemency that you won't find yourselves going, what was that word, what? But also because it has a very particular meaning in the Roman world that it's sort of lost in modern usage. Clementia was a personal quality that was demonstrated in the relationship between two people, one who had more power and one who had less power. It actually takes Seneca rather a long time to give a definition of clementia. Instead, he gives lots of definitions of what it isn't, how you don't do clementia, such as giving in to your outrage or offence when you suffer an injury, doing harm just because you can, acting under the influence of anger. It's the complete opposite of cruelty or savagery, which responds to situations irrationally and without impulse control, and even actively seeks out ways to be inventively vicious and violent towards their unfortunate victims. So these are all things that Seneca says, clemency, not that. Interestingly, perhaps surprisingly, he also wants to be clear that clementia is not the same as pity, misericordia in the Latin. Seneca sees pity as a moral weakness because of the effects it has on the person who is feeling it. In contemplating the misery that somebody else before us is experiencing, we too become miserable. Even though sort of the situation that we're in isn't actually a problem, we become upset and sad because of seeing somebody else's. Now, this isn't saying that Seneca's advocating heartlessness. He's not, but he would instead say that clementia, or sort of a different kind of sympathy, is the correct response. And again, misericordia is a specific emotion. It's just worth flagging up that pity sort of merges the lines a bit in some ways. Somebody demonstrating clementia can still be sympathetic for a person in bad circumstances, but will pay more attention to the underlying reasons for them and how that fits into the bigger picture. To use a slightly silly example, let us suppose that there is a cat stuck up the tree. The person feeling pity, as Seneca defines pity, will wring their hands and worry about whether the cat is scared and stand nervously waiting for it to fall, and will panic about what will happen if it doesn't hit the ground properly. The person feeling clementia will go and get a ladder. Okay? So that's kind of the distinction that he's trying to draw there. So what then is clementia? Now Seneca, as I say, does eventually give us a definition. Clementia is the self-control of the mind with the opportunity to take revenge, or the gentleness of a more powerful person towards a weaker person in deciding punishment. So it's a virtue that, as I said before, displays itself particularly in relationships that are imbalanced by power hierarchies, where one person is higher than another. And as Seneca is writing the De Clementia, he's got I've realised I've put on benefits on the bottom of all these slides. I'm terribly sorry, that should all read De Clementia on the bottom. Working on two texts at once, and clearly my brain has melded. Never mind. As Seneca is writing the De Clementia, he's got a very particular reader in mind, and that consideration concentrates his focus on how he's presenting his material. So De Clementia was written for the Emperor Nero in AD 56. Nero was just 18. He'd only come to the imperial throne a couple of years earlier when he was 16 after his adoptive father Claudius's death. Seneca had been Nero's tutor since 49. So there was quite a long-standing relationship between them that had been formed when Nero was quite an impressionable boy. So while Seneca doesn't quite have a captive audience, he's got somebody reading this who he knows is going to take what he has to say with a certain level of authority. But Nero is the ultimate leader in the terms of the Roman social world. So by the time that Nero took office, the power of the Roman state had really been concentrated in the hands of the emperor. That's a trend that's sort of started by the Emperor Augustus, who sort of manages to stop civil wars. And they go, no, I'm the first among equals, but incidentally, I will just take all the power. It will be fine. And this consolidates until you end up with the Roman emperor being the figure we think of when we think of sort of the all-powerful emperor of the empire. So that sort of first among equals idea has really become rhetoric by this stage. When Nero and Seneca's writing, the emperor is the top of the tree. He's got access to virtually unlimited power. Technically, the Roman Senate could act as a sort of a limit upon the actions, but in reality, so long as there's sort of some veil of judicial acceptability over what he's doing, he can more or less get away with pretty much anything. As such, there's a real motivation here for a man talking to an 18-year-old boy, suddenly realising what he might be able to do with this unlimited power, and perhaps try to persuade him that going over the top and using it to its absolute extents and doing whatever he feels like might really not be a good idea. Yeah? There's kind of quite a strong motivation. As somebody who teaches 18-year-old boys, I mean, they're lovely, but imagining them sort of as sort of being put in control of the world is a slightly concerning thought. This is also true of 18-year-old girls, in fairness. But, it's you can see where he's coming from with this treatise. So he's writing a treatise that's addressed to Nero, about a virtue that's primarily expressed through not using the power that he actually has. So Clementia thus gives us a bit of a paradox. You can only demonstrate Clementia if you have the power to harm other people, but in order to demonstrate that power, you have to not use it. Okay? So it's sort of a weird negative virtue in a sort of way. Deciding not to act might actually be a more powerful moral decision, or in case not acting sounds like we're being a bit complacent and a bit passive, perhaps a better way to frame it would be deciding to act in ways which don't make the fullest uses of your power. So finding other ways to respond to a situation where your first instinctive response might be harsh reprisals. This might well be why Seneca spends so much time talking about what Clementia is not. You can tell someone is demonstrating Clementia as much from what they don't do as from what they actually do. However, Seneca's readers need a little bit more help in working out precisely what Clementia looks like than this sort of rather abstract way of thinking about it. So to help them, Seneca uses a number of images which are meant to illustrate this and help his readers sort of think through what's going on here, and sort of make this rather abstract idea a bit more concrete. And the image I'm going to talk about today, John has sort of flagged up that I'm interested in the family. The image that Seneca really uses here is the image of the father, and how that works. And he dwells on it in some length, and this sort of extended parallel I've got up on the slide is explicit that the duty of the good emperor is that of good parents, which then turns into the good father as the passage continues, outlining how the good father responds to an erring son. And Seneca finds this a helpful image for his readers because there are certain parallels that exist between the father-son relationship and the emperor-citizen relationship. And those lie sort of deep in the structure of the Roman family, which is headed by the paterfamilias. He is the oldest male, and the familia sort of encompasses a wide spread of descendants through the male line, women who've married into the familia through a particular kind of marriage ceremony, even the enslaved people who are claimed as property by a given household, right? So this is not sort of the family as we would think of it, even though the word familia sounds very close. This is a much, much bigger group. So the paterfamilias had patria potestas, a father's power, literally, over everyone in that familia. And that meant he essentially had unlimited authority over their lives and indeed over their deaths if you were in his control. So this makes him an excellent figure to think with when advising a man with complete authority over his powerless subjects. So this boundless power, technically without juridical limit or oversight, we'd have very few examples of it being used to sort of its full extent, but it's there and people are thinking that it's there and are talking about it. It exists. Led to quite a few tensions in the father-son relationship. A son remained under his father's control either until he was emancipated or until his father died. So that means, for example, that a grandson might not actually be under his father's control, but under his grandfather's control, while his father is still under his father's legal control, right? Because the oldest male is the person who has the control. Just have a moment and think what that would mean for your family, just out of interest. So a son who is under his father's control, any man who's under the paterfamilias' control, can't legally own property, he can't make a will. Technically, he has no money of his own, right? He's all completely under the control of the paterfamilias. That is where the legal authority of the family lies. Now, there are various ways around this and various sort of fiddles that are sort of found in the Roman legal system to make this be somewhat less harsh than it sounds. But the reality of a son remaining under his father's authority past young adulthood led to a real concern that frustration and this really very extended period of sort of enforced incapacity might eventually tip over. Those frustrations might tip over into parricide. Okay? The Romans are really concerned about whether sons are going to kill their fathers, essentially so that they can take out loans against the family estate and sort of go off and gamble and drink lots, which is apparently a thing. Okay? They are really, really worried about this. If you read sort of the legal sort of practice text, this is something that comes up again and again and again. It's the frustrated son getting rid of the father. So for the Romans, the ideal father was supposed to play a significant role in his son's moral development and was meant to bring him up through his own example, through that of his ancestors. This is the Togatus Barberini holding some ancestor masks. But the danger that the father's unlimited power, that authority, it always lurked in the background of their relationship. There was always this problem with this hierarchical issue. And very little room for manoeuvre. So while it was possible to see the father as a benevolent influence, there was no getting away from the fact that ultimately the father had all the power in this relationship, right? It's very top-down. So with that in mind, let's go back to this passage and how he talks about this as a way for the emperor to understand what's going on and how he might demonstrate clementia. So because the father has patria potestas, he has the capacity to demonstrate self-restraint in determining the consequences of another's actions. So he can decide to respond to somebody in his potestas in a kinder way, in a sort of more generous way than he technically could. So Seneca leads us through the various stages of reprimand that are available to fathers. You can do scolding, you can do threatening, you can even offer corporal punishment. The ultimate reprimand is disinheritance, so being cut out of your familia, losing your right to inherit the property and the wealth. Now, given that the familia in the Roman world is essentially a mechanism for the secure transmission of property, being cut out of that chain is a really serious threat, okay, particularly to sort of the kind of elite men that Seneca's writing to here. But Seneca is emphatic that the process of working through these available punishments is very gradual, it's very slow. There's an emphasis on looking for ways to help the son improve. We don't see the current state of the son's morals and behaviour as evidence of an irreversible downward trend. There is no going back. The father's always going to offer advice and guidance to help him improve, see the potential for a recovery and improvement. So, in fact, when thinking about when it might be appropriate to take this extreme step of disinheriting someone, Seneca says the father will only do that when he fears something worse than he has reprimanded. And I think that's a fairly clear allusion to this concern about parricide as a constant threat to the father and his existence. Now, Seneca never actually refers to the full extent of the father's power, the right of life and death in this treatise explicitly, although it's a really important part of the cultural landscape he's evoking. But it's a deliberate admission. By treating disinheritance as if it's the most extreme he can do, as opposed to the fact that a father technically can order his son executed, Seneca quietly sidelines the possibility of capital punishment available both to the father and to the emperor. It sort of gets brushed out of the picture. So the implication is that even though a father has the legal power to execute his son, in reality he would never choose to do so. So that's a valuable lesson for the emperor and for other readers to learn about the possibilities of power and the practical implications of its use. This may have been too subtle for Nero, so we get a couple of examples. The first is of a Roman knight, Trico, and this is the closest we get to this power ever being talked about, who flogged his son to death and was barely saved from an angry mob in the Forum who tried to stab him to death with their writing pens in outrage at the fact he'd actually done this. So here we've got the example of a father who has taken his legal power to its limits, to its reasonable limits, but not to its hypothetical limits, but who then has to face an extremely hostile public reaction to his decision to exercise those rights, which goes as far as endangering his own life. So Trico's experience highlights the informal social restrictions which operate on power and its exercise. Just because you can act in a certain way doesn't mean that your community will approve of it when you do. For Seneca, of course, the underlying message is very clear. As Trico's failure to show clementia towards his son puts his life at risk, so Nero's decisions might lead to his life being endangered by the outrage of his discontented citizens. So the memory of the Emperor Caligula's assassination, which took place in 41 AD, that's still a fresh memory. So the possibility of this kind of political outrage being enacted is still very strong. So there's actually a serious message here for the young Nero. And the second example focuses on the case of Tarius, whose son plotted parricide against him. After investigating the accusations, he sent his son into exile in modern-day Marseille, whilst continuing to provide him with a comfortable allowance. So in the face of the worst domestic crime that the Romans could conceive of, Tarius' response is not to seek revenge and exercise his own right to an equally brutal reprisal. Instead, he opts for clementia, holding back his power, showing affection for the offender, but also acknowledging his guilt. So fathers then give us a powerful example of how to show clementia to those over whom we have power. The emotional affection that a father feels towards his son is supposed to sort of moderate any impulse towards any retribution that you might feel. So such a bond between the two parties, having that kind of affectionate feeling, is critical in creating that impulse towards clementia. And it also basically makes life just a bit happier for everybody else concerned, if you're not at each other's throats. Who would have thought? Seneca talks elsewhere about the experience of the ruler who does demonstrate clementia. He will be loved, protected, and revered by the whole state. So the work that's sort of put into building these kinds of connections is going to pay off in the affection that the ruler himself experiences, the leader himself experiences. So what then can we tease out of all of this as lessons for leaders today? Well, first of all, I'd just like to point out that these lessons are not actually all for men. Although Seneca was a man, writing for a man. The Stoics are very clear that since reason is the only thing that one needs to have to be virtuous, and that since all humans have the same kind of reason, all humans have the same potential for virtue. So the social frameworks that Seneca is writing in were very gendered by his time, but the fundamental doctrines that he explores can be applied by everybody, which is sort of just something to be aware of. So although Seneca advocates for clementia in part because of Nero's position of authority, there is, these lessons sort of work for anyone in any kind of authority, team leaders, parents, medical professionals, CEOs, wherever we are, this works. The importance of clementia is it shows us we don't have to be bound by the guidelines that are laid down for us. We don't have to go to the extreme all the time. Although we may have the power to throw the book at someone, we also have the power not to throw the book. Right? There is an option there we can choose to explore and to work with somebody rather than just go, no, done. Right. This is not the same as complacency, letting things slide, ignoring things. The Stoic leader will pay attention to those he's leading and offer them support and care to give them a chance of improving or returning to the right path. And the quote I've got up on the slide here talks about the need to persevere with those who are experiencing problems. And Seneca here talks about this as sort of articulating it as illnesses of the mind, people who are experiencing sort of any kind of mental fatigue. And again, think about this, Seneca's thinking about reason, rationality, intellectual engagement, right? You'll see that the way Seneca sets this out makes it clear he thinks you need a good deal of psychological canniness to be able to find the right way to speak to individuals in particular cases. Some people he'll make ashamed, some people he'll dupe, some people he'll deceive in order to sort of make them do things they don't realise are going to be good for them until it's too late. The kind of psychological knowledge that Seneca is expecting his leader to put in here is pretty high. But you don't just sort of turn your back on the problem. You have to engage with it in a creative and sincere way that attempts to cure the problem, cure the illness, as Seneca frames it here, rather than ignoring it or alternatively just, giving up on the individual concerned. Now, as is usually the case with Stoicism, there are no easy answers and there are no fixed principles for the Stoic leader to follow. Instead, she has to rely on the use of her reason to guide her to the rational and the virtuous course of action that as she seeks to lead. She's got to actually use her reason to think through these circumstances. But what Seneca's discussion of clementia does highlight is that patience and care for others is a significant element of Stoic leadership. It's not about having your own will done or imposing your agenda on others, regardless of what sphere you're operating in, but instead it calls the leader to consider the condition of those that she is leading and to make sure that they have the opportunity to develop their reason and their virtue under her leadership. Thank you.